Good morning, y'all. It's good to be with you this morning. Hope everybody had a Merry Christmas, that you enjoyed your holiday. Hopefully you got to spend time with family in a way that was safe and enjoyable and encouraging for everybody. Well, this morning we are going to wrap up this series of lessons we've been doing over the last few weeks, laying the background for our study for Hebrews. Last week, as we continued this series of classes on these background topics, we talked about the notion of atonement and sacrifice as the way that sins were atoned for. Among other things, last week, we saw that atonement is the process of restoring the broken relationship between God and man that is caused by sin, by paying for those sins through the blood of another. Under the old law, we saw that it was contingent, that atonement was contingent upon sacrifice. That was the ordained practice by which the atoning blood was offered, that sin could not be dealt with without sacrifice. The most significant, of course, of these sin offerings that we talked about last week was the one that occurred on the Day of Atonement. The Day of Atonement. This was the one day of the year that all sins were atoned for, even those secret sins, those sins that were unknown, those sins that people might not have realized they committed, that caused Israel to be perpetually unclean. On that one day, God dealt with all of those. All of these things, though, blood sacrifice, a day of atonement, sin offerings, all of this was required as part of under the old law, which was part of the old covenant between God and the people of Israel. Yet what exactly a covenant is, and exactly how it relates to the law, is what I want us to think about in our time together this morning. The word covenant or law appears some 33 times in 27 verses throughout the book of Hebrews. Clearly, something that's mentioned 33 times should tell us something about how important it is to understand part of the message of Hebrews. It first appears briefly in chapter 7, and most prominently in chapters 8, 9, and 10, but also in chapters 12 and 13. But it is so prominent in chapters 8, 9, and 10 that you cannot understand the message of those chapters without understanding the notion of covenant. Because beginning there at the end of Hebrews chapter 7, where we find that Jesus is a guarantor of a better covenant, he is the guarantor of a better covenant. Chapters 8, 9, and 10 are going to walk us through the way that the old covenant has been done away with and replaced by a new covenant sealed and mediated by Jesus. Now, as we have made clear each week, we're not going to dive into those particular ideas today, comparing those two covenants and why one was first and second or better, or you understand why they were first or second, but why one was better than the other, or why one had been replaced, or the problems with the first. We're not going to get into that. But hopefully what this does show is the importance of understanding the notion of covenant and the particulars of the old covenant in order to understand the book of Hebrews. And so with all of this in mind, we then must ask the question, well, what is a covenant? Well, hopefully most of you were with us in our study of foundations of faith. And if you were with us for our study of foundations of faith, then some of this should be familiar to you because we talked about this. Now, it's been a few weeks now. That was lesson 2, and this is lesson 4. And so what that means is it's been about 14 weeks since we first talked about, or 15 weeks since we talked about covenant in our study of foundations of faith. But hopefully some of this will ring a bell with you. Well, biblical religion is inherently covenant religion. In fact, the entire story of the Bible is punctuated by God's covenants with individuals and peoples. The teachings of the Old and New Covenants are set, Old and New Testaments rather, are set in a covenant framework. And so this idea of covenant is central to the story of God and His people, because a covenant is the relationship between God and His people. A covenant, most simply, is a relationship based upon promises or sworn oaths. A relationship based upon promises or sworn oaths. So in this regard, the relationship between God and His people, whoever that people may be defined as, whether it be the people of Israel or the new spiritual Israel inaugurated under the new covenant, but regardless of who it may be, it is the relationship based upon sworn oaths or promises that exists between God and His people. Now, in the ancient Near Eastern world, there were a lot of covenants. There were some covenants that were parity covenants, covenants made between two equal parties. Most of the time, though, covenants were not like that. Covenants almost always involved a power imbalance, where one side held more power than the other. In fact, most of the time when we see a covenant made in the ancient Near Eastern world, it was done between a sovereign power and his subordinates, or between a more powerful nation and a weaker nation. These types of covenants were commonly signified by charters, treaties, loyalty oaths, other various forms of binding legal agreements. And so as we think about this idea of what a covenant is, particularly what a covenant was in the context of the Old Testament culture, the ancient Near Eastern world, it helps us begin to understand what exactly we mean when we talk about God having a covenant relationship with His people. In fact, many of the covenants we see in the Old Testament are covenants in which God chooses to bind Himself to a person or people and their descendants through an oath. And we begin to see that play out in Genesis 12, right? In Genesis 12, 1 through 3, it's a passage that we're all familiar with. It's one that we've spent significant time looking at, talking about, and studying over the last 9 months or so. Because when we started these online classes, we were just about ready for Genesis chapter 12. But in Genesis chapter 12, you know the text there. Beginning in verse 1, we find these words from God to Abram. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." In Genesis 17, we're going to see this covenant renewed and taken once again a step further. And there it is that we will, in Genesis 17, beginning in verse 4, God says, "Behold, my covenant is with you, Abraham, and you shall be the father of a multitude of nations. No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham, for I have made you the father of a multitude of nations. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make you into nations, and kings shall come from you, and I will establish my covenant between me and you and your offspring after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant to be God to you and to your offspring after you. And I will give to you and to your offspring after you the land of your sojournings, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. And God said to Abraham, as for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your offspring after you throughout their generations. This is my covenant which you shall keep between me and you and your offspring after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised. And God's going to go on and explain the process of circumcision there. But the core idea here is that in this introduction in Genesis 12 and then again in Genesis 17, we see that God makes a covenant with Abraham. There is a mutual promise here. God promises to be the God of the people, to be the God of Abraham and his descendants. He promises that it will be an everlasting covenant. He promises that he will bless him, that he will bless the world through him, that he will make him the father of many nations, that he will give him his people an inheritance and a land. And Abraham, it says there in Genesis 17, was to uphold his end of the covenant through circumcision. Circumcision was the seal, the sign of the covenant, the other half of the obligation. In a covenant relationship, both parties make promises that they are agreeing to uphold. And on the basis of both sides upholding their end of the relation of the covenant, the relationship exists. Covenants are a two-way street. Well, we could look at, from there we look at another of these covenants that we see in the Old Testament. The covenant God makes with David. In 2 Samuel 7, 11 through 16, there we find where God promises and makes a covenant with David that one of David's descendants would sit on the throne forever. This is a different kind of covenant. It's made with a person rather than with an entire nation. But it's still a promise. It is a relationship. And God says, I will uphold my end of this. The prophets Isaiah and Jeremiah will take this promise of God as one of the key elements of the messianic hope for Israel's future. And indeed, this covenant with David will be crucial. And God will uphold his end of the bargain in the coming of Jesus through the line of David. But of course, when we think of covenants in the Old Testament, the one that really stands out to us, the one that immediately comes to mind, is the covenant that God makes with the people of Israel. The Mosaic covenant, the Sinai covenant. And we see that covenant played out in Exodus 19 and Exodus 34. In those texts, particularly there in Exodus 19, when they are first there, we see that God lays it all out for them. He's speaking to Moses, and he says there in verse 3, the Lord called to him out of the mountain, saying, thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the people of Israel, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the people of Israel. God tells Moses, go tell Israel that if they will keep my covenant, I will be their God and I will bless them. In Exodus 34, we see this play out even more as we see this covenant reiterated. And so there in verse 10 it says, and he said, behold, I am making a covenant. Before all your people I will do marvels, such as have not been created in all the earth or in any nation. and all the people among whom you are shall see the work of the Lord, for it is an awesome thing that I will do with you. Observe what I have commanded you this day. Behold, I will drive out before you the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Take care lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land to which you go, lest it become a snare in your midst. God will continue to warn them about the dangers of making a covenant with the people of the land they inhabit. And we know that this was a common practice in the ancient Near Eastern world, but God says, you have made a covenant with me. Observe my covenant. Keep my covenant, and I am going to do great things among you. I'm going to do things that the world has never seen before. And all the nations of the earth are going to marvel at the things I do with you. But you have to keep my covenant. In these texts, we're introduced to a core component of this notion. On the basis of God's deliverance of Israel from Egyptian bondage at the Red Sea, God here offered his people a covenant relationship and added to the requirements that they must obey his voice. The people, out of gratitude and out of their experience of God as gracious, bound themselves to keep the words of God before they even knew what those commands were. Now, it's important to pause for a moment right here and draw a bit of a distinction between the covenant and the law. Sometimes I think in our minds, covenant and law are just the same thing. Old covenant, old law, Old Testament, these are all just the same, different ways of saying the same thing. But that's not exactly true. The covenant is the dynamic relationship initiated by God with his people. The law, then, are the terms of the covenant. As we have already noted, covenants are relationships between multiple parties that involve both sides meeting and upholding agreed upon commitments. In this case, the old covenant between God and Israel, as it was instituted at Sinai, was based upon Israel's obedience to the laws given by God. This connection between covenant and law was critical. The covenant is the relationship itself. The law are the terms of the covenant. The law is what Israel must keep to obey the voice of God, which is what they have agreed to do as part of this covenant relationship. This is how they obey. These are the details of it. But it's not the relationship. The relationship is in the covenant. The ideas of covenant and law are indeed related, but they are not the same. And we need to be careful not to conflate those things. Yet, in all of this discussion of the Old Covenant, it's also worth noting that according to Deuteronomy 7, the people had been chosen by grace, not by their own merit. There the text says that the people of Israel were the fewest of all the earth, but the Lord loved them. Continuing in that same passage there in Deuteronomy 7, Moses reminded Israel of God's past faithfulness and states, "Know therefore that the Lord your God is God, the faithful God who keeps covenant and steadfast love with those who love him and keep his commandments to 1,000 generations, and repays to their face those who hate him by destroying them." God's covenant relationships with his people have always been on the basis of grace. No one has ever done anything to deserve a relationship with God. On our own, we cannot have a relationship with God because we have sinned, and sin inherently divides us and God. It drives a wedge between us that keeps relationship from happening. But God, in His infinite grace and love, chooses to have a relationship with man. He makes available a covenant. And in response to that covenant, the faithful God who initiates it says, I will indeed be faithful, and my past action shows you that I will be faithful. And He calls the people who are in covenant with Him to in turn be faithful to His laws, to love Him and keep His commandments. Well, those of you who've spent any time studying the Old Testament know that Israel did, in fact, turn on God. They're not going to always love God. They're not going to keep His commandments very well. At times, they're even going to lose the commandments and forget they even existed in the first place. It was only because of the covenant that God made with Abraham that they were shown grace during their disobedience. The covenant with the people of Israel remained because of God's faithfulness, not because of Israel's obedience. But even in the midst of all of this covenant in the Old Testament, God was still pointing to something that was coming. It is crucial that we understand the Old Covenant, that we understand the covenant that was made between God and the people at Sinai, that is sealed and signified and upheld through the terms of the law of Moses. But even while that covenant was in existence, God was promising something more. And in Jeremiah 31, starting in verse 31, we find these powerful words. Jeremiah 31, beginning there in verse 31, Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. Not like the covenant that I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. My covenant that they broke, though I was their husband, declares the Lord. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts, and they shall be my people. And no longer shall each one teach his neighbor and each his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their iniquity, and I will remember their sin no more. This is a crucial text here in Jeremiah 31. In fact, this text is going to be quoted in Hebrews 10:16 as the Hebrew writer talks about how God brings this promise to fulfillment. But here we find that this new covenant would not be like the Mosaic covenant. Yes, it would still result in the creation of a people for whom they would be God's people and He would be their God. That part stays the same. When God makes a covenant relationship, it's always, I will be your God and you will be my people. That's always part of God's relationship through covenant. But under this new covenant, the rest of it changes. The law would now be written within, on man's heart rather than on tablets of stone. Additionally, this covenant relationship would be based upon God's forgiveness of their sins. The consequence of everyone knowing the Lord indicates that instead of coming into a covenant relationship based upon natural birth, people would enter this new covenant by a conscious choice based on their personal knowledge of God. that by virtue of them knowing God, they would choose to enter that relationship. You wouldn't have to be born to the right parents to have relationship with God. No, now you could choose to know Him. You could choose that He would be your God. Jeremiah and Ezekiel will further flesh these ideas of the new covenant out in several other places, which ultimately help us to see that this new covenant will have as its essence the forgiveness of sin and the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. This new covenant was being promised. It was being prophesied about even while the old covenant was in existence. And so it is in this context then that we come to Jesus of Nazareth and His fulfillment of the promise for a new covenant. And with Jesus having become the fulfillment of that promise, we find ourselves finally ready to dive into Hebrews chapter 1. But what I hope you have gotten over these last 4 weeks of background information is a better foundation to launch into this, from which to launch into this study. The reality is that, as we've mentioned several times, Hebrews is a challenging book, partially because it was written to a people in a completely different culture, with a completely different worldview, with a completely different understanding than what we're trying to interpret it from. So oftentimes what makes Hebrews so hard for us is that we don't understand the depth of what the Hebrew writer is saying, because it is not a context that we ourselves are familiar with and have lived. Now, I don't think we fully are prepared in just 3 30-minute sessions over a couple of major Old Testament ideas to dive into that. I'm not saying we're going to be able to pull out every last detail. No, that requires still more study on all of our parts to better understand the context of God and the relationship He had with His people in the Old Testament. But we don't have the time to teach that. Hopefully, though, what these last few weeks have done is given us enough of a foundation that we can engage with these ideas. And so, I'm excited to finally be able to dive into Hebrews chapter 1 next week. And I hope you will join us, mindful of all the ways that the message of the book of Hebrews is building upon the rich story of God and His desire to have a relationship with His people. Because the same God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is still inviting us into relationship with Him. And that, folks, is good news. Y'all have a great week, and we'll see you all next Sunday.